Thanks very much, Speaker. The government has been keen to give answers in question time and speeches to the House concerning lawlessness, and they often want to rush to the chamber reporting on what the federal court has had to say. Funnily enough, when the federal court made a decision roughly 10 days ago regarding raids where the media turned up before the federal police did, that federal court decision never found its way into the parliament.
Very quiet.
That federal court decision isn't one of the ones that the minister decided he needed to tell us about. And why? Because the form of lawlessness that had been uncovered was lawlessness from the Registered Organisation Commission itself. So we have a federal court decision which had to take place because the Registered Organisations Commission had commenced an investigation that was found to be beyond their power, an investigation that was found to be unlawful. And what's the government's response when the Registered Organisations Commission does something unlawful? It's actually, well, behind people are saying, is it crickets, is it quiet? It's actually worse than that. Their response is to say, let's give them more power. If an organisation created by this government is acting unlawfully, but doing so in a way that it's unlawfully acting against unions, their response is to give the organisation more power. And lawlessness from their friends, the Registered Organisations Commission is not the only example of it. The ABCC, we had Nigel Hadgkiss, the leader of that, go when he was breaching the Act. And what was the breach that he was doing? He was telling employers to break the law. He was telling employers to break the law. That's how he broke the law, and so they keep wanting to give that organisation more power as well. Jerry Hansen, we find Jerry Hansen, a big donor to the WA Liberal Party, a big donor. This is not someone who's bought a few raffle tickets. We're talking $175,000 to the federal and WA Libs and Nats over the last 5 years or so. In 2008, he was fined $174,000 for exploiting foreign workers. A decade later, an audit alleged 93 employees were underpaid by him more than $270,000. Underpaying people by an amount of money even bigger than what he donates to the Liberal Party. And what's the punishment for him? What's the punishment for him on the laws that are here? Because it's not just underpaying people. It's after there was a death on his work site, he blocked an occupational health and safety inspection from a union. Blocked a health and safety inspection after a death on his work site. And what's the government's response? Oh, well, there will be a punishment for him. He won't be allowed to be a union official. That's the punishment. That's the new law that's responded. I don't know if those opposite appreciate it, but the public are onto the fact that their attack on unions is simply an attack on workers. That's all it is. When you defend the people who underpay, you attack workers. When you defend the organisations that attack the unions, that are responsible for arguing for better pay, you attack workers. Every time they block and support their Liberal donor mates who block access for health and safety inspections, and even today we had the minister wanting to go straight from James Hardie to health and safety inspections to desperately talk about another issue, but everything they want to do is about blocking access to safer workplaces and better remuneration for workers. And that is the simplicity of the strategy that is coming from the government. It's no accident that they voted to keep penalty rates. Every time the Prime Minister says, oh, independent agency made that decision, we know how they deal with independent agencies. When there was an independent agency meant to make sure that truck drivers had safe rates of pay and they didn't like the decision the independent agency made, they didn't just abolish the decision, they abolished the entire agency. But here, when a decision is made that they support, they back it in every time, and the reason they supported it was because it meant less pay for workers. Simple as that. Simple as that. You know, if lawlessness was in fact the issue for them, if lawlessness was something that they wanted to act on, they would have abolished the Registered Organisations Commission, they would have deregistered 7-Eleven as a company, they would have prevented Jerry Hansen and a series of celebrity chefs from employing people in the future. Because if the concept that they've got is, if someone has had any sort of breach of the law, therefore you should not be able to do that job again, how come every single person engaged in wage theft goes on to continue to employ people and probably rip them off again? Why does that happen? Why do we get no response there? We get these sudden thundering comments from the minister today that, oh no, if the opposition's saying that they want to put up with levels of lawlessness, when he did concede, I think we were onto it, that he has no idea what happened in the James Hardie dispute. Absolutely no idea. And if he thinks that the problem there was unlawful industrial action, well, can I say he's following a fine tradition of members of the Liberal Party from his state in spending a whole lot of their time defending James Hardie against asbestos victims. The former member for Curtin had a proud record of it as well. Because what happened in the James Hardie dispute was the actions taken by the unions were not during an official bargaining period. They were not actions that would have ticked the box of authorised industrial action. They were a series of actions that would have breached Section 28G of the legislation that's in front of us right now under the Ensuring Integrity Bill, where the test is whether or not an entire union can be deregistered, whether or not their action, unless it was protected under the Act, which none of this was, whether or not it interfered with the activities of a federal system employer. Well, of course it did, and it needed to. They engaged in an escalating series of protests, work stoppages, work bans, boycotts, as well as the marches, the investor activism and the political lobbying. But had they not engaged in the work stoppages, the work bans and the boycotts, James Hardie would have got away with it. They would have got away with the massive transfer of funds offshore to make sure that people who were dying with asbestosis never got the compensation they deserved. And I thought maybe we would have got a better response last week when we had victims of asbestosis in the gallery and we told the government they were there. And what was the response? The minister goes off in his rant about the CFMEU. And the Prime Minister, sitting in that chair, after I'd pointed exactly where they were sitting, swings his chair to face the minister and turns his back on them. We often talk about this government turning their back on workers, but you rarely get a demonstration of what this government is all about, when there are people who, if ensuring integrity legislation had been in place at the time, never would have been eligible for compensation. The money would have gone offshore. James Hardie would have got away with it. James Hardie would have got away with it had those union protests not happened. And please, the response over there, oh, that's rubbish, that wouldn't have happened. The people on your side were acting for James Hardie. Acting for James Hardie. And it was the unions that took the action that made sure we ended up getting compensation and that James Hardie was held to account. Now, let's not pretend that James Hardie is an issue distant into the past and it's never going to happen again. We know as long as there are employers like Jerry Hansen, we know as long as there's operations like what we saw with some of the franchisees in 7-Eleven, we know as long as there's employers like a series of the celebrity chefs making millions of dollars for themselves but just can't afford because of the complexity they claim of industrial relations, even though they can comply with tax law, all the volumes of tax law, but they can't check an award to make sure they're paying people the right amount. As long as employers like that exist, there will be a need for employee representation. And this government, in attacking employee representation, is attacking workers. It's part of the low-wage strategy that is a deliberate design feature of this government.